the walking lunge is the single most underrated exercise in the gym, and it's not even close.
Yeah.
I just think, your access of all three planes, your full underloading of one limb in a true unilateral setting. Shout out to our boy Jerome, did a post the other day. If you're not following the Muscle Mechanics on the Muscle Mechanic, I think is his IG handle. You have to follow him. He's the GOAT.
He's
legend.
the man.
And he brings up a point about we oftentimes denote exercises unilateral that aren't. They're split stance. Right, everything from rear foot elevated to B stance. It's like no. True unilateral comes into this adoption of center of mass over base support. The force absorption component. What happens when you're trying to apply force with a particular intent of decelerating? I think there's just so many movement qualities that it picks up. And I'll tell you this, and this is what I think its real benefit is. And there's exercises that share this quality. That from a hypertrophy standpoint of the quads or the glutes or maybe a little bit of the adductors, what it does well is it takes the bottleneck of most it takes the bottleneck of most people's stimulus and growth, which is instability of the pelvis, and it drags that and puts a light on it. And it says, right, nothing moves until this moves. So you don't end up with quads and hamstrings and glutes that are bigger or stronger or more able to produce force than the pelvis that they are attached onto. So I think one of the reasons they're so hard is because you're fighting that. You're making the main thing the main thing. And then once you make the main thing, progress in your lunge is the progress in your quad, glute and adductor development. And it's almost like a 1-to-1 ratio. So I think I actually can't remember a time where I wrote a program. I'm sure there has been times where I wrote a program where that movement has not been in it in some way, shape, or fashion, body weight or otherwise.
Yeah, completely agree. The walking lunge is the single most beneficial exercise that I think people can do. If you were to do one exercise for the rest of your life, it better be a walking lunge. I don't think that this could be highly rated enough, so it has to be underrated. Just the amount of benefits, the loadability, scalability, like as long as you continue to get better at a walking lunge, you're going to get better at most things athletically. And even if we're talking about holding 70, 80, 90 pound dumbbells, like there is benefit to core strength and shoulder function here as well. So it couldn't be rated high enough.
Yeah, I agree. I would much rather see someone increase the weight of their weighted walking lunge before I see anyone do like a farmer's carry, for example.
Yeah.
Right. I would rather someone do 20-pound walking lunges than 200-pound farmer's carries. Word. Now, farmer's carries are an interesting one. And maybe if we have time, we can throw that at the end because I think there's a conversation to be had about underrated, overrated, and context specific. So I don't want to go too far down. I do want to acknowledge that was the first one that's been on my list as a duplicate. So I'm proud of us for kind of like, mixing it up a little bit. So, okay, machine overhead press.
Oh, this is interesting. Fuck. I don't think I know enough of the sentiment of this, but my gut reaction here, and I'm going to go with it, is underrated.
Boom.
Yeah. And this is funny. Maybe we'll go here next because I had overhead press on my list, just regular, not machine. So this might be a good transition. But the reason I'm calling this underrated is because most people do not have the proper stability to do an effective overhead press. So I think a machine overhead press gives enough external stability and external support where you can get the benefit of moving overhead and doing so in a stable means. So it will reduce any of the relative risk of the exercise. And relative risk, not saying that exercise is inherently dangerous, but if we're loading tissues that we're not meant to be loading, like I've seen people herniate discs doing overhead presses, right? I haven't seen that on a machine overhead press. So it's kind of reducing the relative risk of this specific exercise because of the added stability and that kind of uniplanar motion that we have. So I'm going to say this is something that is probably underutilized and underrated in a lot of people's programs.
100% agree. And once you said it was interesting, I could see you having that conflation of like, okay, common decrease access to range of motion. Most people don't have good mechanics for overhead, but the machine aspect, augments that instability, minimizes risk, allows for output. I think so. I watched you follow the trail of breadcrumbs, and I 100% agree. Like the fact that I've never once, and I can't really say this of almost any machine, I've never once had a hard time in any gym at any hour getting on an overhead press machine, and it
Yeah.
always blows my mind that that's the case. Of
Yeah.
like such a useful tool to attenuate with almost with a minimal margin of error, a high output in an unstable position. I fucking love it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. That's getting towards the idea of how valuable a walking lunge is to the lower body. I think some sort of overhead press and like machine overhead press, I'd probably even go a step further and say like a landmine overhead press would be a similar like analog to the upper body for what a walking lunge is. So it's like, I think there's so much value in moving through that overhead range of motion in terms of coordination, stability. And when I say coordination, I mean like from the pelvis, rib cage, scapula, shoulder, all the way to the wrist. Like I think there's so much benefit in that, but I think it is something that it requires. There's kind of a high barrier of entry to understanding that coordination, and this bridges that gap perfectly. So from here, I'll throw it back on you with overhead press. This could be barbell, dumbbell. You call it
Free
weight overhead press, not machine.
So I'm going to go with underrated for a lot of the reasons that you laid out. I just, the barrier of entry is one, I don't think it's as high as people give credit. What am I trying to say? I think it's something where if you can't, you should be actively working to be able to. I think that's the utility, as like it's a carrot in the programming, in the motivation of your programming, that if because here's the thing, like, and I've seen this happen for the better part of a decade now, especially when I got into online coaching. When that goes, you start putting in yourself in a smaller and smaller box of pain-free function, right? Or pain-free range of motion.
Yeah.
Right. So this is true of like, there's some ancillary exercise that I'm sure we kept off the list of like, overhead tricep extension, but overhead movement, especially concentric overhead movement, it's a completely different game. Right. And so I say concentric, I mean pressing, where eccentric overhead would be pulling, right? Because the weight's pulling your shoulder up rather than you pushing against an implement to move it through space. So I think if you can't, there should be that should really take up a bit of your time in your program to be like, okay, what are the underlying things? And now there's a lot of different ways, a lot of different roads that lead to Rome in this case of like, okay, this would come all the way down to the bicep curl variation that I pick. Maybe I need to get that expansion in my ribs. Maybe I use a preacher. So I work feverishly in the early stages of exercise programming for someone who doesn't have active range into a free weight overhead press position. And, I think it's worth contextualizing what I'm aiming for. I'm probably aiming for, a 7-degree high incline press on a chair as like my benchmark of the overhead. Standing with a barbell, I think is useful, but we start to run into like almost this bench press territory of like, is it the most useful thing? But I think in minimizing these bottlenecks that could inhibit other aspects of your training, it should something that should be absolutely on your radar. If day one you can't program, or you're not programming overhead pressing because they can't. I'm taking a look at T-spine rib cage function. I may even take a look at diaphragm orientation. I'm going to look at scapular mechanics, goniohumeral mechanics, and figure out why and how I can most aggressively start to improve it so they can. Then if I choose to, then I can, but I'm not choosing to because they can't.
Okay. Interesting. Because I have the same exact reasoning as you, but I'm going to go overrated on this one. And
Okay.
the reason I'm going to say overrated is because like just being in a gym, I see so many people go up to a squat rack, load up a barbell, and do overhead presses. And they're lacking that coordination piece. They're lacking that kind of stacked rib cage over pelvis, scapulothoracic stability piece of this that makes it the as valuable as this movement is. So I think the reasoning is the same for me, but I think the people that I'm speaking on, they need to regress to a machine overhead press because there's kind of this propensity to jump towards a barbell overhead press without necessarily having the prerequisite stability and coordination to be able to execute it on the way where they're getting the benefits from that.
Yeah, I can get down with that. I like that. So, and I think this is going to be. So I have two left, and I think this will be in a similar vein. I'm pretty sure I know your answer. Pull up.
Pull up, wildly underrated.
Yeah,
That's
yeah, for sure.
again, and I know your answer on this already. We've had many conversations about it, but a pull up is probably one of the more difficult movements for people to do because of how unforgiving it is. It's like if learning to squat, there was only a bar with 225 on it, right? Is
Right.
we
Yeah.
have our body
Yeah.
weight versus gravity to do a pull up, and that's not 100% true because there are pull up assisted machines, there are banded variations, eccentric variations, but I think that the goal to be able to perform a pull up and perform it well should be a goal for everyone that steps foot in a gym, right? Just the amount of shoulder function, the amount of strength relative to body weight, um, even like the grip strength portion of it, to be able to hold on to a pull-up bar, like it requires a lot of shoulder stability, scapulothoracic stability, core stability to be able to transmit that force so far distally. I think that there's just so many benefits to being able to do a pull-up and being able to do it well that this is one that has to be underrated because I don't see enough people doing them.
Yeah, and I don't think it's early, like to your earlier point about like walking lunges of like you really can't. It'll always be underrated because you can't overrate it enough. Like to me, it's that to the upper body for sure. So okay, we're in agreement as I thought.
All right. Yeah, I'm down to my last two, and these ones are a little bit kind of curveballs, but my next one is a med ball throw.
Oh, interesting. I think the deciding factor here is going to come down to if there is disagreement with you and I. Um, it's going to be based off context.
Yeah.
Um, so this is how I would contextualize it. For hmm, I'm going to just, you know what? I'm just going to say overrated. I'm going to
Okay.
say overrated because it's emerged in popularity without understanding its full utility. So by that, it's overrated because intention matters, because intention tells me what you're going to do next, not what you just did. So the
Mm,
outcome of what you do is as based off your intention, is even if the outcome is good and we're somehow in agreement with you utilizing that tool, if I understand the intention or lack of intention of why you utilize that tool, I'll know whether or not that was a good choice of an exercise, even though the outcome in this current situation is the same regardless. But I know whether or not you know how to apply that effectively in the future. So given the number of times I see people apply it, although maybe in a context that could be useful in given time, without a reasonable explanation as to why, I think it's overrated because the intention dictates that they actually don't know what it's good for. So, it's something, it offers something in a way similar to the lunge where there's a full unloading, right? There's a true, what I think a true concentric phase. Because a true concentric phase is, you could potentially look at like a trap bar deadlift as like a similar type of expression, but there's an underloading and deceleration component to it, right? Like if I'm throwing a ball, that one changes the position of my center of mass as I hold it, two adds resistance to muscles as I throw it. there's an immediate change in state of a body the moment the ball is now no longer adding weight or deviating center of mass. There's that I think is a really useful integrated tool. As an expression of power, it's not great at building power, right? So I think I look at it much more from the neurological side, especially if there's these med ball throws have like a catching component to it, which is probably where I would use them most often, in like some sort of integrated cerebellar type coordination, integrating something post injury. But as far as like power, and it's funny, that actually leads well into my last one. I don't think it does wonders for developing power. I think it is okay at expressing power. So when I look at it, one, the benefits, transverse plane, oftentimes med ball tosses. Now med ball tosses can be more sagittally based. I would say overrated because the intent is not clear in the context that I see it applied. And we had Derek Hansen on the show years ago, and he said something really interesting that stuck with me. I was actually kind of quoting him this week, and it was something to the effect of like, most power training is too heavy to be fast and too light to be strong. And it's like you kind of get this med ball thing kind of exists in this weird middle ground of like muddled stimulus and no adaptation. So I'm gonna go overrated.
All right. Where do I even go with this? Because I have a lot of opinions. So I'm gonna say I utilize med ball throws and catches quite often, and I think they are a very good tool when the intention aligns with the need of the athlete. But because I think it's rare that is how they're implemented, I'm going to agree with you. And I'm going to say that they're overrated because it's not going to create a great adaptation. The benefit I see from med ball throws is more so what you were mentioning around accommodating center of mass, and having a greater degree of variability in the movement pattern itself than what dumbbells, kettlebells, machines, cables, barbells will typically allow for. So I think it is a good tool to train kind of more fluid multiplanar movements. But it does come back to the way that I see them utilized the most often is not the proper utilization or how I would utilize them. So even though I can see med ball throws as a very valuable tool and I use them often, I do think they're overrated in their kind of common implementation.
Okay. This actually, my last one is the Turkish getup, which I think is another law of across the plate, and your right answer for this. So I'll leave you to say your right answer.
If we didn't do this, I think we were probably pretty close to doing this in the early days of the podcast, is making a t-shirt that said "fuck Turkish getups." Like I don't think we did that, but it was probably on like a short list of things that we had to do. Just the other things were way more important.
Yeah, the fuck off strong shirt. Anyone that's been around since OGRX days that has a fuck off strong shirt, shout out.
You're
real OGs.
The real OGs.
Okay, so overrated.
Completely overrated. There's the benefits that you can get from a Turkish getup are so muddled by the complexity that it just doesn't make sense. There's no time that I've been with a client and I've been like, oh, the problem that they have can be solved with the Turkish getup, right? It's just too complex, very low stimulus. There's not enough benefit to doing it. There's no real adaptation you're going to get out of it. I really couldn't justify, if I have a session with a client, I couldn't justify that exercise's place within that session when there's so many other things that we could do that were so much more valuable and would capitalize on that time better. So I'd say if anyone's ever using this for any reason, it's completely wrong.
100% agree. Fuck Turkish getups. Okay, that's my list. Pretty good.
Yeah. All right. My final one. There's a time that I would know where you stood on this, but I don't think I do right now. So my final one for the day is going to be the Zercher squat.